ANS.
This is Dr. Clarno.
Dr. Clarno, what inspired you to pursue nuclear engineering, and how has that influenced your path from where you were started as what inspired you to pursue nuclear engineering?
I was a high school junior, taking AP physics. And while I was in physics class, we had this little short, tiny section that was about sources of energy. And I saw that, coal and wind and natural gas and solar power and hydro and all of these things are sources of energy. But you looked at how much density there was in nuclear energy, both fission and fusion. And it was like the amount of train cars of coal that you need to produce the same amount of energy in a tiny little amount of uranium is staggering. And so you realize that there are countries out there that don't have access to coal and oil, that have to import that stuff. There are countries out there that don't have huge land area. They don't have the size of Texas to be able to set up windmills throughout and gather all of the wind energy you need. So there are places that need a whole lot of energy in a very small space. And nuclear is the king of high energy density places. And so you just look at it, and it's just one of those things that you say, we're always going to need more energy. You look, human history, the cheap energy and the availability of energy makes people healthier, safer, better off well-being across the board. And so energy is so key to human health that everyone is always going to be increasing the need for energy. Throughout the world, there are places that don't use nearly the amount of energy that the U.S. needs. And so there's just this huge need for energy in a lot of places that can't get it from their own resources. And nuclear is a thing that you can create a nuclear reactor. It can have a relatively small land area and produce the energy needed for hundreds of thousands of people on just a tiny land area. So for a lot of countries, it will eventually be the necessary source of energy. And even for countries that have tons of land area, it's absolutely critical to provide cost-effective, hopefully, and reliable source of energy. And so in high school, I looked at this, and it was just a few paragraphs, and I went, well, that's just intuitively obvious. At some point, nuclear energy is going to have to become a dominant source of energy in this country. And so as a high schooler, I said, I want to go into nuclear engineering. And so I started looking for colleges that had nuclear engineering programs.
To those that know you, it's always impressive how well you meld your heart and your head, and how you have such a clear vision looking forward. Okay, for those that don't know you, can you briefly describe your work and your projects?
Well, sure. Let me start with my family, though, because it's one of those things, if you don't know my family, you probably don't know me. So I've been married to my wife, Kenzie, for 23 years. She's amazing. She's brilliant. She's a phenomenal mom. She takes care of so many things. And she's just really successful at everything she does. We have 4 kids. So I have 2 kids that are in college now. Grant's at the Air Force Academy. Charlie is at Abilene Christian. One's doing physics. The other's doing radio, TV, film, completely different directions. And then I have 2 more kids. Drew is a junior in high school, and Lucy's in 8th grade. So, my path and how sort of, I got to where I am, I was still in college. I went to MIT for undergrad and then Texas A&M for grad school. While I was in grad school, Grant was born. And so I was looking for a job that, I need something. And so I got a job out at Oak Ridge. And while I was there, I started continued working on nuclear energy, because for my undergrad and grad school, I was doing nuclear energy. And just consistently, you could see how one step that you didn't see in front of you just sort of appeared. And it was like, hey, here's another step, another opportunity. Let me take that opportunity and walk in that path that just sort of kept appearing in front of you, that you saw cool, interesting things to do. You jumped to that new cool thing. And one of them, 5 years ago, was invited to come, apply to be a professor at UT. And while I was in Knoxville, my oldest son was a freshman in high school. And one of the cool, amazing things is to get to go and start to become a university professor when your kid is still in high school, because you start to see what's going to happen before they get there and they have to address it. So it's been really cool to be able to see the way that God just creates these steps and these paths in front of you that you can walk down that path and walk into situations where you can continue to use your expertise, and all of the things that you've been prepared for start helping you forward.
But of course, nuclear energy is such a big field. There's like management, design. Well, was there a moment in your life that like pivoted which aspect of nuclear like you wanted to actually do?
The cool thing about that is summer internships were really helpful. So when I was an undergrad at MIT, my first summer after my freshman year, I went and I was on a survey crew. I don't know if you guys have ever seen people on a survey crew. There's, the people that are looking through the camera and trying to figure out, what is level and where do we need to take measurements. And I was the guy holding the rod, jumping across the highway with the orange vest, trying to not get hit by a car. And that told me, get your college degree. Don't stop college, because it's 110-degree Texas heat. It's miserable on that job. So I really appreciate my buddy's dad who gave me that job and that opportunity to realize I don't want that job. My next summer, I actually worked out in Carlsbad, New Mexico at the Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, which is a nuclear waste dump. And doing that, I was doing safety analysis, and I was evaluating, how do these processes operate? How do you keep this nuclear waste dump safe? How do we make sure that we're taking care of this waste? And I realized I wanted nothing to do with nuclear waste. It's not interesting to me at all.
It's a waste of time, I guess.
I cared about producing energy, and it's really important that we have good people who care about nuclear waste. It's just not what I wanted. I found that it wasn't what was interesting me, and I'm glad there are people that are excited about it. The next summer, I got a job working at Bettis Atomic Power Lab in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and I got to work with an incredible nuclear design researcher where in the Navy, they are building new subs and new aircraft carriers all the time, as they're always designing and innovating new things in their nuclear reactors. And so I got to work alongside a phenomenal reactor designer, and he said, hey, let me give you a challenge. Let's see if we could change the way we design things. And so all the people who have been here tend to tweak what we always do, try to do something completely new and out of the box. And great opportunity. I was like, wow, nuclear design is really interesting, because you have to work with radiation transport and heat transfer and structural mechanics, and you have to account for all of these different things. And so I went back to college, and the next summer, I had decided I definitely want to stay in school and get a master's. And so I was looking around at colleges and was like, do I stay at MIT, or do I go to where my girlfriend at the time was, who I've been married to for 23 years. So I went and visited Texas A&M and was like, this is a great graduate program. Let me come check it out. My undergraduate advisor said, hey, there's a professor there, Yassine Hassan at Texas A&M. He's a great professor to work with. So I went and I planned on doing my graduate work with Dr. Hassan. The summer before I went, between schools, I was working at ABB Combustion Engineering in Windsor, Connecticut for a summer internship. And there I started doing safety analysis calculations. And so they said, every time a nuclear reactor needs to refuel, they operate for 18 months, and then we take out part of the fuel, some of the fuel, and put new fuel in. We need to reevaluate the safety of this. And so I got the experience to work on what it's like in doing nuclear refueling design and nuclear safety analysis, and what it looks like to evaluate the safety of these systems. And said, there's a lot there that's really interesting, and the business side of this is very different also. And so on my undergraduate research, I had some economics and some design optimization, and then I saw this safety analysis piece. And so when I went for my master's research at Texas A&M, I was doing safety analysis and was looking at what would it look like if how is a reactor going to respond if you have a huge accident, if there was a huge break in a coolant line. And so I was using a computer code to model that and predict what would happen, because some things you don't want to experiment with, let's not take a real operating reactor at full power and just lose all the coolant. So we want computer models to do that. And so I was using these computer models to predict the accidents and see what would happen in the accident. And it was really interesting. But while I was doing that, I had another professor come and say, I have a really interesting project that just popped up, and I think you'd be great for it. Instead of looking at the fluid flow and the heat transfer side, why don't we look at the how the radiation moves through this environment, how the neutrons move, because people are trying to recycle nuclear fuel, and they'd really like to take the plutonium that is out in spent nuclear fuel, separate it out and put it back into reactors so we can burn a whole lot of that fuel. And so we were looking at what needs to happen to understand power distributions inside of nuclear reactors if we use this advanced fuel, this MOX fuel that they were thinking of using in the early 2000s. And so in that experience, I got to take a summer internship, and I went to Idaho Falls, Idaho, and I got to work with a company called Studsvik, where they were developing some of the leading software that the commercial industry uses to model how radiation moves through nuclear reactors. And got to work with a phenomenal expert, Cord Smith, in modeling how these reactors work and how would their codes need to change in order to account for this new type of fuel, and what do we need to do with it. And so I worked with them for 2 summers, the whole time doing my PhD research with Marv Adams at Texas A&M, and I got to experience how collaborative research is really done, because we had a project that had Texas A&M and Oregon State and NC State and this private company, Studsvik ScanPower, and seeing how you have teams of people that each carve their project out and work on their piece, but you interconnect these pieces. The next summer, I got a fellowship, and the next summer I got to go back out to Bettis in Pittsburgh and see what it was like, not as an undergrad, but as a grad student, what that looks like. And so how do the Navy research labs develop their software, and how do they do comparable things to how the private industry did? And just being able to have job experience in these environments to see what it's like, I got to see different areas of nuclear, and I got to see what are the things I like and what are the things I don't like. And so that helped direct and shape me in where I was going. And so that was really the most useful piece. But even once I graduated and went to Oak Ridge National Lab to start working, I jumped into one area, and it wasn't long before I was saying, okay, well, I got my education on radiation transport, let me use it. And pretty soon I started realizing, well, there are a lot of other challenges. It's not just the radiation transport. Where does the data for that come from? How does the temperature and the density of the materials come into play? And so it wasn't long before I started having to account for the other physics that come into play, the heat transfer, and bringing back some of the things that I had learned before and go, okay, how does the heat transfer and the fluid flow come into play? And that expanded as we started looking at nuclear fuel and how does nuclear fuel behave. And I had to learn structural mechanics and high performance computing. And throughout that whole process, you could see that there was the challenges got to be more complex, and they incorporated more and more fields. And so it was sort of like I felt educated in this little piece here and educated in this piece. And then I started to realize, I need to be collaborating with better mathematicians and computer scientists, because we need to use big computers to solve these problems. And I don't know anything about structural mechanics and material science, so I needed to lean on and lean into friends of mine that had expertise in these. And so you start to realize that more and more, to make high impact, you really have to develop a team of collaborators where you're able to learn from each other. And they were learning from me, and I was learning from them, and we were figuring out how to solve these problems together. And so when the opportunity came up to come to University of Texas, what I had realized was it's phenomenal developing the software that models these things, but one of the areas that it was really lacking is there was a huge separation from the people that modeled reactors and said, what if you broke a coolant line? What would happen from the people that actually operated nuclear reactors and nuclear systems? And the world of experiments and operation in so many ways was kept completely separate from the world of computer code modeling. And they would generate some data and throw it over the fence. And the modelers would take that data and say, yeah, I look pretty good. So now you can trust my answer everywhere else. And so as I was coming to UT, I was looking for a university that would help me continue to do multidisciplinary research, but expand from just the computer codes and the methods and how we use the computers and modeling the physics into how do we begin to integrate the software with the hardware, with the experiments, with the real operating systems. And so that's been what's really exciting here at UT is how this university has really encouraged and enabled multidisciplinary collaborations and not just solve a little problem on one field, but how do we take all of these problems and address the big problems that are the challenges today?
And to not leave it open to interpretation. What do you identify as the current big challenges that require this collaboration? And what do you think the future big challenges are?
Well, so there's always phenomenally interesting problems, and there's so many challenges in science and engineering. In my area, what we see is that there are a lot of companies right now that are trying to commercialize advanced nuclear reactors. You can go and you can say, hey, I want to put in a purchase order and buy a big new modern what they call Gen 3 plus reactor, like the AP1000. And you could say, hey, I want to build this. And there are facilities here in the state of Texas. South Texas Project has 2 operating nuclear reactors. Comanche Peak has 2 operating nuclear reactors. They could go out and say, let's get another reactor and add it to our plant. And it's the same big size. Those have a ton of value. But they've also had a lot of challenges. And so there's an idea that we'd love to see put into practice of let's build smaller reactors that you can purchase with far less capital, so you don't need nearly as much loan to get into it. And they're going to produce less energy. And so maybe this is the kind of thing that could be built, not by a electrical grid and a big energy company, but maybe there is some company that says we want to build our own nuclear reactor. Good example of that is Dow Chemical has said we want to work with this company called X Energy, and we want to build an advanced nuclear reactor that is sitting right in the side of one of our chemical facilities and chemical processing facilities, supplying all of the energy needs for that chemical processing facility, and maybe even some extra electricity that we could provide to the Texas electrical grid. So there's new interesting opportunities that smaller reactors that can be factory built, so smaller and modular, could provide. And some of those are very similar to the existing reactors like the AP1000 that are the same solid fuel with water coolant. But there are a lot of other designs that are more exotic, that have some different potential with regard to more inherent safety, possibly better economics, possibly more efficient energy storage opportunities. And so these advanced nuclear reactors have a whole lot of promise. But to take it from promise of nuclear energy to some company says, well, yeah, I'll spend my money. I want to build that. That's a pretty big leap. And so we need to do a better job, a more consistent job of understanding how are these reactors going to operate? How are we going to allow them to improve design after design as a reactor is operating? How can we improve the processes for continuing to innovate in their fuel, in their materials, and their components so they can continue to improve their operation, their effectiveness? One of the things that we've seen is in the nuclear industry, it is difficult to innovate. It's difficult to come up with, incorporate new ideas and prove that they're safe so that I can put it into my system. because there is a high threshold is that your change going to make it worse? So you need to convince the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that your change is going to be safe. And that can take time in the traditional way of running experiments and gathering data. So we need, as an industry, we need to figure out how we can speed that cycle of innovation. Nobody's using their, iPod Generation 1. Everybody's gotten rid of those things. They're completely useless these days. We know that in technology, the faster and faster that you can take the innovations, bring them all the way to market and put them in a system so that they can be used, the faster you can do that, the faster you can invest in those innovations, the faster those innovations can make an impact to the world. And so we need to figure out on these advanced reactors, how are we going to enable that innovation advancement?
And you were talking about before that digital twins could be like that answer. There's such a delay between like new innovation and actually implementing it. So can you tell us about like how digital twins could help speed up that innovation?
Yeah, and so a digital twin. So if you have some physical system, and you have mathematical models of that system. And so I've done plenty of mathematical modeling where I say this is the foundational equations that describe the physics in this. If we get some data that would feed into those equations, then we can predict what would happen. And so similar to, what would happen if we lost all the coolant? We have equations that say what should happen. If you have some data that feeds into it, then it can predict something. The accuracy of that prediction depends on the quality of the software, of the models, of the data you feed into it. Meanwhile, you have these physical systems that you might create an experiment that would test what happens if you lost that coolant. But you don't want to do it with a real reactor. So you say, let me make an electrically heated experiment and see what would happen. And so it can generate some data that informs those models. And so the information flow tends to be from the experiment to the models to make the models better. So you can say, see, my model is accurate. Well, the idea of a digital twin is how can we use these models actually help those experiments, help that operating system work better? So maybe we could run a whole bunch of those experiments. Maybe we can change how and where we electrically heat these things to provide more data to make that simulation more accurate. Or maybe that digital twin is of a university research reactor. So maybe what we're doing is we take this university research reactor that is always generating data. And if you're going to let university students operate a nuclear reactor, you got to make sure it's really safe. And so the University of Texas has a research reactor, and we're helping a group build a university research reactor in Abilene. And so with these university research reactors, they're turning on, starting and stopping every day. They have a class and they say to a student, why don't you take this neutron absorbing control rod and we will pneumatically eject it from the middle of the reactor, and we'll make the power of this reactor jump by a factor of 100 or 1,000 in a microsecond. And then you can see that it is so safe that when the power jumps by a factor of 100 in the first microsecond, it immediately drops and goes back to about where it was because of the inherent safety of these systems. And so anytime you're building a university research reactor, you're going to have a really safe, stable system, but you're also going to make it do really crazy things that you would never do with an operating commercial nuclear reactor. And so it's generating more and more data. And so all of the reactors that are the university research reactors operating throughout this country are generating data that could be used to improve the computer models. And maybe the computer models could help those reactors learn to operate more effectively, learn to project when there might be failures, when there might be errors, if something is going wrong. And so the digital twin is a connection between the physical system and the computer model. So the computer model is always getting better, and it can feed information to that system, so it's always operating better. And if you learn how to do it on an experiment and you learn how to do it on a research reactor, you can take that knowledge of how do we do this and say, let's apply this to an actual operating reactor. And so now you say on my new small modular reactor that I build, I'm going to put a whole lot of instrumentation on it so that I can gather all kinds of information about what's really happening inside of it. And that excessive amount of data can provide lots of useful information to these computer models so they can get better and better. And those computer models can run case after case of, hey, what would happen if, to generate a whole lot of understanding of how that physical system should behave and when to identify if something is going wrong or if something is acting different.
But of course, like when making those models, like if they're only as good as the data, right, that you actually put into it. So like, what are the ways to like actually like minimize the uncertainty in those input data, and like, how could it go out from there?
So this is where I find my friends who are phenomenal mathematicians. Because in many ways, if you have a whole lot of data and you have an idea of how accurate is this and some uncertainty in that data, that becomes a really big math problem. And so there are mathematical methods to take that data and do the uncertainty quantification and say, given the uncertainty in this data I have, what is the uncertainty in my estimated solution? How, if my solution is off, how can I adjust the data I'm using within its uncertainty bands to be able to have a more accurate answer? And so that becomes a really challenging, interesting math problem. And I rely on my friends, the mathematicians, to give me a hand and say, here are the best methods that we have come up with. And these are the right methods, given your data and your problem. These are the right tools and the right methods that we should be using. And so you partner with experts in these other areas to develop that capability.
And that's where the collaborations that you were talking about earlier come into play. And right, that's where you need to collaborate.
That's not the only place they come into play. Again, I don't know anything about real operating nuclear reactors. I've done all computer modeling. And so the people that actually sit at reactor controls and press a button, like those people really know what the real system's like. The people that design and develop the instrumentation that measure these things, they know the quality of that instrumentation and what instrumentation should you use and what can you not use. And so as a computer modeling guy, I'm like, well, clearly you know the temperature to 7 digits of precision, right? And I go, no. In fact, if we put a temperature probe in there, it would change the flow, and then it would alter the flow and alter the temperature. And so by putting in instrumentation, it changes the system. And I'm like, well, in my computer models, I can just ask what the temperature is there. So there needs to be, throughout this whole process, a whole lot of leveraging the expertise of different fields and different domains. Yeah, throughout this process, it requires lots of interdisciplinary research, lots of teams, and in reality, it's more than any one person can even get their head around. And so you have to look at these problems collectively. You have to leverage the expertise of a diverse team with diverse understanding.
Absolutely. And you've been working on like multidisciplinary collaborative teams, like as you mentioned earlier. One of the projects you didn't mention was like the Castle de Vera project.
Yeah.
That's huge. Can you tell the public a bit about that?
Yes. So while I was at Oak Ridge, I first started working on this code called Scale that was just mostly radiation transport. And then I got pulled into a project that was hey, let's develop a new capability where we do radiation transport coupled with fluid flow. And I'm like, all right, where's my expertise in fluid flow? I need to find him. And where's the mathematician? Because if we're doing two physics, I know one and he knows one. We need somebody else that knows how to make this stuff work on big computers. And so we had a really cool team. With a mathematician and a fluid dynamics expert and myself, and we started developing this capability. And then we had people at different national laboratories say, hey, I see what you guys are doing. What if we added some to that? What if we started modeling not just radiation transport and fluid flow, but the structural mechanics problems? And so then we started looking at nuclear fuel performance. And so now we added the structural mechanics. And so I was working in a program for a U.S. Department of Energy, Office of Nuclear Energy, had a big program called Nuclear Energy Advanced Modeling and Simulation, or NEAMS, and got to work with experts at Sandia and Los Alamos and Idaho National Lab and other universities. And we started working on developing high-fidelity modeling for what happens inside a nuclear fuel. And then the Department of Energy said, you know what, we can think even bigger. And so when President Obama came into office, his Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu, had worked at Bell Labs. And he said the way we did big things at Bell Labs, the way we solved big problems, is we created teams, interdisciplinary teams. We co-located them in one place, and we said, here are some critical challenge problems. You guys figure this out. You got time, you got the money, you got the resources. Let's make this happen. So Dr. Chu said, we want to do this at the national lab scale. And so he identified a group of about 8 different huge grand challenge problems. And one of them is, how do we enable the existing commercial light water reactor industry? How can we use high performance computing to solve some of their most pressing challenges? And so Oak Ridge National Lab was the lead of a team with 10 institutions. So Oak Ridge National Lab, Los Alamos, Idaho, and Sandia National Laboratories, University of Michigan, NC State, and MIT, and 3 industry partners, Westinghouse Electric, Tennessee Valley Authority, and Electric Power Research Institute. And so they said, this is going to be our team. We aren't going to have everyone move to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, because not everyone likes to live in Tennessee. As a Texan, I can understand it, but it's a phenomenal place to live. And there are a lot of places where if they had told me I had to go relocate, I would have said, that's not going to happen. So we took advantage of video conferencing way back in 2010. And so we started doing regular video conferencing, scientific collaboration, where we identified a series of these grand challenge problems that were limiting to the nuclear industry that we thought that simulation could help with. And so in that project, that was called the Consortium for Advanced Simulation of Light Water Reactors.
Castle.
Obviously, CASL. And so in the Castle project, we identified a variety of these big challenge problems. And then we said, okay, what do we need to do with regard to software to solve them? And so there were teams of material scientists and radiation transport and fluid flow people and big computing people and professional software development people that were saying, okay, if we're going to solve these, we need to understand the physics. We need to have everybody collaborating. It was an incredible project where year after year, we started to understand more and more of the challenge that we were facing. And in many ways, when you're beginning a project, you go, oh, this is what we'll solve. And then as you dig and you gain more understanding of what you said you were going to solve, you realize it's a much harder problem. And so every year it was like, okay, I understand more, I know more, which tells me I have a better idea of just how far I am. But through this project, in the first 5 years, we were making huge strides on modeling the primary regular commercial reactor, pressurized water reactors. And as we were digging into this and understanding it, we started to be able to really chip away at some of these big problems. We started to be able to make an impact. For the first 4 years or so, the nuclear industry, they didn't even want to pick up our stuff. We would pay them, like, please try to use it and tell us what's wrong. And they're like, till you get that fixed, I don't even want to look at it. More and more we started to see them saying, okay, you have enough here that I'm willing to use this. You have enough that I'm willing to try something that's out of my wheelhouse. So their software that they're used to using runs in 5 minutes on a single processor. And they're like, I get pretty good answers. And we came in and we said, okay, what if we had 2,000 processors? They said, I don't even have a computer that has 2,000 processors. Where would I even run it? Okay, what if we gave you access to a computer that had 2,000 processors and you could set it up and you could run your cases? And in the high performance computing world, 2,000 processors isn't a lot. But to these nuclear utilities that were used to one, that was a crazy, mind-boggling thing. And we said, this might take 30 minutes to run. And they would go, 30 minutes? What? That's crazy. How could I possibly not get an answer for 30 minutes? And so there was a big developing and understanding of what are their expectations and what can we really do and what's going to add value to it. And a reactor had been ordered in the 1970s, and they stopped building it sometime in the 1980s or 90s. And it just sat there as a partially complete reactor. And they decided sometime in the aughts, maybe early 2010s, that they wanted to finish that reactor. And so they decided, we're going to finish Watts Bar Unit 2. Watts Bar 1 was operating, had been doing great for decades. They said, we're going to get Watts Bar Unit 2 started up. And so it was basically a brand new old style reactor. So the AP1000s were the new style reactor. This is a brand new version of the old one. And so with that, they were able to pick up this code, and we were getting data every hour from the Tennessee Valley Authority. And we were able to say, here's our prediction of what it should be. Here's what your measured value was. And every time they changed the power, every time they changed something, we were able to show how accurate these predictions were compared to what they were experiencing. And they started to make the connection that this is not just a more understanding of what's there, but this is actually producing even better answers than we could have expected. And we can start to believe what's happening here. And so one of the things that happens inside of nuclear reactors is you have corrosion happens on the heat exchanger side, and it'll put metal ions in the water. And where in the reactor core, where you have boiling happening, those ions can get deposited, and that deposit is called crud. And so that was another problem, is that we said, okay, we've shown how we can do the radiation transport and the heat transfer. And some of the utilities, Duke Energy in particular, said, we have a real problem with crud. It's causing us to operate far away from what is optimal. And if you could help us understand where crud gets deposited and when and why, then maybe we could be more optimal in our operation. And so that's when we said, okay, now we have to incorporate microchemistry, micro heat transfer, because this heat transfer and chemistry is happening on the surface of these metal tubes that are little tiny spots inside of a giant nuclear reactor. And so trying to incorporate better resolution fluid flow and chemistry and surface chemistry and corrosion into this just added more physics and more experts from different domains to pull in and try to understand how to address this problem and how do we generate data for it. And so with that, the Vera code started having more capability that could help these utilities understand where is this crud, why is it developing, how can we operate more efficiently and still not have a limiting amount of crud growth. And so that Castle project was fantastic, but it was fixed. It will be 10 years and no longer. So it went from 2010 through 2019, and it was like, it's done, it's over. But that software has now actually been used by about, I would guess, about half of the pressurized water reactors in this country.
Wow.
About 35, 40 different reactors. It's been used to model their entire lifetime and what's happening with it. They've taken that software and they said, let's make it commercial. And so there's a private company called Veracity that is using that software and trying to help the industry pick it up and use it. Because it's still the case that the industry says, I still don't have 2,000 processors. And I still don't know how to use big computers. And so how do they continue to develop that software? How do they enable it for the industry to be used and make an impact on more effective, safer, better understood operation of these existing commercial reactors?
When you're talking about like developing software for nuclear reactors, I know it's like most of the like a engineering problem or like a computer science problem, but like how often would you have to use theoretical nuclear physics and understand that better in your own work?
I'm going to generalize your question to not just theoretical nuclear physics, but more theoretical scientific understanding. Because it isn't just physics, it isn't just atomic physics, but there's fundamental microstructural material science. There's fundamental interfacial fluid flow. And so there are things that we tend to think of at sort of the engineering scale. If you turn on your water faucet and the water is flowing through the hose, you're kind of looking at how much water came out of my hose. But inside of that hose, there's all kinds of complex physics that's happening inside of that. And so in a nuclear reactor, there's atomic physics, like you're talking about. No doubt. There is interesting complex fluid flow physics and material physics. And so all of these different domains have an engineering scale level and a sort of lower length scale microstructural level. It really comes down to the problem you're solving. So if you're solving a single physics problem, you can often start to say, let me dig into that deep atomic physics question. If I want to know the probability that a neutron is going to hit a uranium-235 atom, and I know the speed that that neutron is traveling, then, can I go measure this? Well, it's difficult to measure that probability directly because it's hard to create a neutron that's traveling at a specific speed to hit a single atom that's all by itself. And so there is some uncertainty in that measurement. But you also have a whole lot of phenomenal atomic physicists that say, I know the atomic physics of what would happen when a neutron comes and hits in that atom and folds into it, and what happens in the protons and neutrons of that atom, and how it will reshape and how it can change the probability of that reaction. And so when you combine the foundational understanding of nuclear physics with the measurement information that the experimentalists have, you can create a combined sort of evaluated, this is a combination of experiment and simulation that tells me this probability. And then the engineering codes can take that merged, integrated foundational physics and engineering and say, now how do I use that in a radiation transport when it's coupled with all of these other physics at more of an engineering scale? And so there's multiple scales you have to look at in single physics. And so you can do the same thing on material science. How strong is a material? Well, that depends on the structure of the material. Well, what are the impurities? How does that structure change as radiation hits it, as temperatures impact it? And so there is a multi-scale problem in just material science, like there is in atomic physics and there is in fluid flow. And then, but at the atomic scale, a lot of times they aren't multi-physics problems. It's sort of like, let's assume some radiation came in and hit this. At the engineering scale, that's where you wind up having these physics start to integrate and come into play. And different problems require different understanding and resolution of that problem. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
All right.
Interesting.
And well, how do you see the role of artificial intelligence and machine learning in discerning through these
How does ChatGPT affect nuclear reactor physics?
I asked ChatGPT where I could buy a nuclear reactor, and it gave me a variety of options. They weren't all correct. This was ChatGPT 3. ChatGPT 4 may have it. I also, asked ChatGPT one time some simple math problems, and it wasn't very good.
Definitely.
But that was ChatGPT 3, and you can see the expansion and the growth and the development of that understanding. So I think there's a totally different thing between large language models like ChatGPT and machine learning in general. And so in many ways, we've always said, here's a bunch of data. I need to take that data and inform some physics and create some models. And so engineers and mathematicians have been doing that the whole time. What really is changing things is the amount of data that we can generate. And so instead of saying, let me set up an experiment where I'm flowing water and I'm measuring temperature and pressure in 5 different places, you can create experiments where you're putting nanoparticles into that fluid and you're running lasers past it and you're seeing how the laser light reflects off of it, and you see where the fluid is flowing throughout the entire 3D geometry of that. And you're not measuring how much water came out of my hose, but you're like, as it bends around the curve, because there was a crack in the hose down here, there was some turbulence that came about. And so you're able to get so much more data than you ever could before. And so now with all of that data, it's a better question of, we can create more data. What are we going to do with that data? And so how can we take that data? We're generating so much more data that you can't just ask a human to say, look at that data and create some effective line fit for it. You've created so much data that you can start asking the questions of, how can I change those models in my fluid dynamics code so that it becomes more predictive of what happened? So, could I understand that flow around a crack in that hose and how it changes? And so then maybe I could use my computer models to identify, is there a crack, just by looking at the flow that's flowing through the system. And so now you can start to create these loops of information where you have so much more information from measurement that can inform higher and higher resolution computer models that then can predict what would happen and look, is there a problem or is there something changing?
Outside of physics, what do you just like to do for fun?
I love my family. I love my kids. I love seeing what they're doing, being involved in their lives. So I have my kids play different sports. I've had kids that play football and wrestle and pole vault and play lacrosse. I loved when they were little bitty kids and I could be their coach. And then they grew up and got to be in middle school and I was no longer qualified to coach them. And so now they're a whole lot bigger. But I still love being involved in their lives and engaging in the things they're doing when, they're leading things at church youth group. And as one of my sons got to go on a mission trip to Dominican Republic last summer through Campus Crusade for Christ, and getting to hear, hey, what's going on? How are you doing? What's impacting this? And so I just love being involved in my kids' lives, no matter what they're doing. It's exciting, it's fun, and so that's my main outside hobby, is playing with my family and having fun.
Awesome.
Whether it's sports or board games or whatever's going on.
If you could write a message in the sky for everyone to see, what would your message be? Jesus loves you? I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't think people are so simple that there's one thing that we can say. I don't know you from one line, one word you say. And so, I'd rather say, hey, come talk to me. Let's get to know each other. Because the truth is, every one of the people here are extremely interesting and complex. And as you sit down and you get to know people, you get to know their story, you get to know who they are, you realize that there is so much depth to every person. And so I wouldn't want to waste it on a single written in the sky message. I'd say let's get to know each other. Let's talk to each other and find out who you are and what makes you tick.
Yeah, I've heard a quote, like, every person is a world, like if you can change like a person, like you've changed a world pretty much, People can be like so complicated, so like in depth. It's really nice to have those in-depth conversations with them.
Absolutely. They're my brother and I are very different. My brother wants to impact the world, and he wants to communicate to the world in lots of ways, both individually and broadcasting and protest and things like that, in ways to impact the world. That's not my style. My style is entirely one-on-one. I want to get to know people, and I want to get to know people in a way that, what I've learned, what I've developed, I can impact them, and I can hear their story and what they're doing, and they can impact my life. Because one of the things I love about getting to be a university faculty is it's all about learning. It's all about education. And education is so much more than classroom, so much more than experiments. Education is sitting with people and collaborating and learning about them and from them. And that's where I get to see the impact. That's where I get to see what makes a difference.
What do you think you would have done if you like hadn't like done like faculty education?
Oh, well, I mean, as a high schooler, I would have been a professional football player. Probably a offensive lineman, probably for the Chicago Bears. It turns out I'm a little bit small for that and unathletic. You know, I love interacting with people. I love impacting people's lives. And so I don't know how that would have happened, but it would have. I actually think it's kind of crazy that I'm a teacher because I had the opportunity to tutor someone when I was in high school, and I did a horrible job. I was an absolutely awful tutor, and a lot of that comes down to, you know, it takes me a long time to figure out how do I communicate this message, because it's not hey, I'm going to come in and I'm going to teach you this and you're just going to get it instantly. In a lot of ways, you know, I'm a trial and error kind of person. I need to, you know, hey, let me teach this and let me see how people got it. And let me learn from the mistakes I made, so the next time I come in and teach it, I get better and better. And so I was so bad at tutoring that, you know, my mom, who's a teacher, and my sister, who's a teacher, they're like, yeah, you will never be a teacher. And so, you know, I just had to make my students here in class the first couple of years just suffered through my teaching. And I was like, I'm sorry, you're the guinea pig. I'll have it down a little bit better each year. So, you know, those who took my classes in the past, I apologize. I'm sorry.
Public apology.
But those who will come after you will appreciate the learning that I got from that.
I greatly enjoyed your class. I greatly enjoyed speaking with you tonight. Dr.
Yeah,
Clarno,
absolutely.
it's always a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
So much.
Thank you so much, Dr.
Really
Clarno.
appreciate it. Thank you guys for taking the time.